First, let me say a thank you to the Ministry of Health, the Homefront Command, and IPRED for inviting me to join you today to talk about this very important topic. I also want to congratulate IPRED for just a great run and really doing a tremendous job at bringing forward a very important topic. I do note that as an American, I'm standing up here using a series of PowerPoint charts, and I feel a little like I'm not allowed to talk without using PowerPoint, so I hope you'll forgive me. But hopefully the charts will help to bring understanding to some of the concepts that we'll talk about today. Now, my talk is supposed to be identifying and managing cyber threats, and I intend to do that by looking at the following things. First, I want to tell you a little bit about the U.S. Department of Homeland Security and the Science and Technology Directorate. And what I want to talk to you about there is to show you why cyber, information technologies, big data are so important to the very business that we do. So I'm going to do that through a series of vignettes. And in fact, some of the earlier speakers have already talked about some of the events that I'll spend a few moments on, but I hope to give you a different perspective on how important cyber, information, and communications were. So with that as an introduction, let me go ahead and bring up the first chart. So I want to talk just briefly about the environment that we see. And it really comes down to we're seeing many more threats at a time when there are far fewer resources. And this creates very difficult situations for governments as they try to think about how to handle these threats. Now look over at the left side of the chart where I show things like globalization and transportation. Those are good things for humankind. But on the other hand, as we see the events of 9/11 that we just spoke of, as we see the Madrid train bombings and the London train bombings, the very systems that we depend on for transportation and part of our globalization systems also can be a problem. And we like to think about this problem by saying anybody can be anywhere in the world within 24 hours, which means if they are intent on doing harm, they can be at our doorstep within 24 hours. Border security and immigration, keystones of most nations to have appropriate border security, but at the same time to have reasonable immigration systems. But it's this tenuous balance. If you follow what happens in the United States, there's this constant battle trying to ensure that we have the free flow of goods, services, and peoples while keeping out people who should not be coming into our country. Violent extremism, a problem and a growing problem. And I would say one of the major problems we're facing is now not just violent extremism outside of the United States, but the radicalization of certain individuals within the United States. The cyber domain, which is really the subject of my talk today, but here it's a very, very low cost of entry. For the price of a modest computer, you can have a hacker who has extraordinary capabilities. And that brings us to the nature of innovation. And here what I would say is innovation is a two-sided proposition. Both sides get to innovate. We get to innovate. That helps us protect. It also helps humankind. But on the other hand, the bad guy gets to innovate as well. And so in certain areas such as cyber, in biotechnology, in explosives, we're beginning to see individuals with state-like capabilities, something that is very, very dangerous. The misuse of technology falls into that category as well. You see the picture there of 9/11. Next to it is one of the letters from the Amerithrax attacks. And next to it is a little chart which shows the cost of doing DNA sequencing and how that cost has dropped to virtually less than a penny per sequence. And then the final one are natural disasters and pushing beyond design limits. And this is important for a number of perspectives. Think about the areas in which you work as emergency managers or first responders. What I show in that first set of pictures is this oil well called Deep Horizon that exploded in the Gulf. And it's not that this wasn't something that we thought could happen, but on the other hand, when it did happen, people turned to the government and said, fix it, you can fix this. And we had to tell people, we cannot fix it. We don't have the technology. In fact, most of the technologies are not held by governments, but rather held by private corporations, by industry. And so it was an industry issue, and it took an industry solution. The government could monitor and cajole and push and fine, but at the end of the day, it took industry stepping up. And the next one over, those two pictures, are Fukushima. And it's not that the Japanese did not understand that they live in a dangerous part of the world where earthquakes and tsunamis are likely. In fact, they had been very prudent. They had built an 8-meter seawall in front of those reactors. Unfortunately, they had a 10-meter wave, which topped the seawall and took out 4 of their reactors, causing both a problem in terms of the tsunami and the wall of water, but also in terms of radiological. And so you get to the sense of the greater number of threats. At the same time, we are seeing far less resources. Now, here is the Department of Homeland Security, and I show this to you to make a couple points. I don't want you to become an expert in the Homeland Security Department, but rather to understand that it is a culture of law enforcement. Most of the organizations that were created, it came a decade ago, the Department of Homeland Security was developed. Most of them came from law enforcement. And the ones that I show in green are the ones that are the predominant, what we call operational components. And the ones you would be most familiar with would be the big 7 down in those green boxes about 2/3 the way down the chart. The Transportation Security Administrations, our Customs and Border Protection, our Citizenship and Immigration, our Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, Secret Service, Federal Emergency Management Agency, and Coast Guard. And what's interesting about these is, if you ask who cares about cyber and communications information technology of those big 7, the answer is all of them. They need to have protected cyber domain if they're to be able to do their jobs and function. The other thing about this chart is the organization chart shows the department, and it's about 230,000 people in the United States. It's the 3rd largest cabinet level agency behind our Department of Defense and our Department of Veterans Affairs. But the real interesting perspective is when you talk about all the critical infrastructure in the United States that has to be protected, when you talk about all of the different first responder communities and local governments requiring to be part of this thing we call the Homeland Security Enterprise, the number now grows to over 3.5 million Americans that are part of the Homeland Security Enterprise. And that's a very, very large number. I come from the Science and Technology Directorate. I won't spend a lot of time on this, but what we try to do is we try to bring forward solutions, technological solutions. And I have 4 groups that work for me. I have a first responders group that tries to bring technological solutions, including communications, first responder, personal protective equipment, those sorts of things, to the Homeland Security Enterprise. I also have a Homeland Security Advanced Research Projects Agency that has borders and maritime, cyber, chem biodefense, explosives, and resilience as part of their mission portfolio. And again, what they're trying to do is develop knowledge products, and they're trying to develop technological solutions. The next group over does operational research and systems analysis. Very important to understanding how to build capabilities, not just technologies. And then finally, we have something called research development partnerships. Now, we are, in fact, at S&T, the analytical and technological arm of the Department of Homeland Security, which makes it very critical to being able to provide solutions. So that's a little bit on the department and the Science and Technology Directorate. What I'd like to do now is use a series of vignettes to talk about the issues that we face in these large disasters with respect to cyber, information technologies, and communications. So we've already alluded to Superstorm Sandy, and there were a number of lessons learned. First, let me paint the picture in some pretty real terms for us. This storm was absolutely enormous. It was at one point 820 miles in diameter, when it hit land, it affected 24 states. At last count, it cost $63 billion. At one point in the storm, we had over 8 million Americans out of power. And just shortly after the storm, the temperatures dropped. So it became a real humanitarian catastrophe. We were fortunate in that people did listen to their state and local governments. For the most part, people evacuated, which was good news. So the number of deaths was measured in approximately 117. And we had gas rationing in the East Coast, specifically in New Jersey and New York. So what lessons did we learn in terms of what we're here to talk about today? Well, the first is on situational awareness. And we were using aircraft and platforms that came out of our Department of Defense. We were able to get those pictures downloaded, so we were able to very carefully track both the storm as it hit, but even more importantly was the aftermath and being able to understand what damage had been done, and therefore to vector in emergency response personnel, people who would help with recovery from our Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, and so getting everybody together to be able to solve these very difficult problems. We used these interactive GIS map plots to be able to help us all along the way. So that's the good news. I would say the bad news, and this will be a common theme in all the events I talk about, was communications. We're continuing to learn the same lessons over and over with respect to communications, and that is that we are still having trouble communicating between fire and rescue, between local governments, between law enforcement, and the problem is that we need to have solutions where we're all on the same frequencies and we have interoperable communications. The good news is there is a solution. The bad news is that local and state authorities have not yet procured them because all these solutions do cost money and they are not in a position to procure them. The other problem was that many of the systems that they have are capable of voice. They're radio, but they're not capable of passing data. So all this wonderful data we had that would have helped for situational awareness was not available for state and locals who were on the front lines trying to provide that immediate relief. Another interesting lesson that we learned was on the use of social media. And here it really was a two-sided proposition. So social media was very helpful in perhaps signifying that there might have been some sort of event that needed assistance. On the other hand, we learned that there was a lot of misinformation that was in the social media. And so you couldn't just respond directly to the social media, but rather you had to at least use it to cue your systems and then begin to understand what the level of necessity was to be able to respond. So you could not just look and then take that information and act upon it. Let me now switch gears to the Boston Marathon bombing. A couple things here on the Boston Marathon bombing. First, it gets to the very core of what I talked about earlier with respect to the self-radicalization of individuals within our country. We know that the older brother, Tsarnaev, had been radicalized. He had been seen as a radical even within his mosque in the United States before going to Dagestan, where he had spent approximately 6 months. He then radicalized his brother, and then they came up with this plot and they perpetrated the attack. Now, when you look at the Boston Marathon bombing, a couple things are striking. First, I would have to say that if any city in the country was prepared for an incident like this, Boston was at this place and time, and for a number of reasons. The first, they had learned that planning and training and exercises were very important. In fact, not more than 6 months before the Boston Marathon bombing, they had actually rehearsed a much larger mass casualty event. And they had learned many lessons there, which they were able to directly use during the course of the marathon bombing. They were also helped because at a marathon, you have lots of emergency responders at the finish lines, and you have lots of law enforcement. And so they were able to very, very rapidly respond and provide life-saving care, stopping the bleeding, beginning the flow of the air breathing, so that they could save a number of people who otherwise probably would have died. The other thing about the marathon bombing was the use of social media and the way the people of Boston and the surrounding areas came together. In fact, when they put the pictures up of what they thought were the suspects, they didn't realize at the time they were brothers, but when they put those pictures up, for the first couple minutes, excuse me, they had over 300,000 hits of people texting and providing messages and pictures and correlating the information. And so that gives you some idea of the impact of social media. The other thing I would say is that we continue once again here in Boston bombing to learn the lessons of emergency communications. While it was better, it was still a problem. And there were still issues with communicating across different parts of the law enforcement apparatus. For those who may have been looking at the Boston Marathon bombing, seeing it unfold on TV, you'll also note that there were a number of law enforcement agencies that were directly involved, also complicating the ability to communicate. I'd now like to talk a little more philosophically about the cybersecurity threat. And this is somewhat of a complex chart, but let's take it apart. So on this chart, I have three major pieces. First is the countering threats. The next is harmonizing the efforts, and the final one is building capabilities. So let's think about countering threats, and let me just give you some statistics. In fiscal year, or I'll just say calendar year 2013, the United States lost over $250 million on banking and financial fraud. Looking at sabotage and attack, we go back to the 2007 Estonia attacks, in which the government, the press, many of their industries was brought to their knees. Going to hacktivism, go to the Aramco situation. Thank you. Go to the Aramco situation in Saudi Arabia, where we had over 30,000 computers that were attacked and destroyed. They had to be completely replaced because their hard drives had been destroyed. In our own country, denial of service attacks into the banking sector. We had one such set of attacks that was so virulent that it at one point was putting out 300 megabytes per second against individual websites. And those banks almost were brought down, except they were able to push off and defend. But they were virtually just moments away from coming down due to the large volume of traffic. Go to identity theft. The statistic we like to talk about is 1 in 15 US citizens is a victim of identity theft. Money laundering. We now have things like Bitcoin, where you have whole new financial systems that are set up outside of the normal banking systems. Child pornography and exploitation. We recently did a takedown where 70,000 people were taken offline. We arrested 184, and we rescued 230 children who were being exploited. And I would add, that is not just US, that's across the globe. So threats, they're out there, they're getting worse. Harmonizing the efforts, and this is from a very US perspective. But in the center, I talk about this three bubbles: Department of Justice, Department of Homeland Security, and Department of Defense, negotiating what their role would be in this. So Department of Justice, they're about prosecution. The Department of Homeland Security is about protecting the homeland, and Department of Defense is about those threats that emanate from outside of the United States. but we have done a coordination where we've agreed what parts each is going to hold. Look at the diagram underneath it, and it shows you just how complex it is, with a number of our departments, Department of Defense, Homeland Security, Justice, as key players. But it also talks about the importance of private industry and critical infrastructure and academia and non-state actors and international partners all coming together to harmonize. We are in this thing together. And then finally, on the far side, building capabilities. And here, there are a number of different things that we've done. For example, I list out 7 required capabilities. The first, securing federal civilian government networks. Let me give you an example of one. We created a technology which allows that when you hit on a URL, you actually go out to the website that you're trying to get to, and you're not spoofed and redirected to somewhere you don't want to be. That actually is something that we developed in the S&T Directorate that's being fielded globally now. In protecting critical infrastructure, we're putting up things like moving target defense to make our networks more resilient and less predictable. In responding to cyber threats, we've developed computer emergency response teams. In the combating cybercrime, we have 3 organizations, our ICE, Immigration Customs Enforcement, Secret Service, and our National Protection and Programs Directorate that are directly relating to stopping cybercrime. Let me go down to the last one, growing and strengthening the cyber workforce. Critical. We are having trouble actually recruiting enough people trained in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And we also have to train the rest of the workforce, people who are on the network. They have to be net worthy so that they're not doing things that are going to put the entire network at risk. So a very complex chart, but it gives you some idea of the way we're thinking about this cybersecurity problem. We also recently had our president put out what we call an executive order and a presidential policy directive. There are a lot of words on the chart, but what I want to leave you with is this idea of linking of the infrastructure and cyber. So that's an area where we have now started to have a direct linkage to ensure that all of our infrastructure remains behind a secure cyber curtain. I talked a little bit earlier about big data and cyber. And on the left side of the chart, I really wanted you to get a sense of just how much we have to do on a daily basis. And you can imagine the cyber requirements, cyber security requirements that come along with that. In a 24-hour period, we are screening over 2 million passengers that are coming into the United States. We're also screening passengers at airports. We're doing inspections of air carriers and airport security. We also have to patrol over 3.4 million square miles of U.S. waterways. We're naturalizing new U.S. citizens, 3,200 in a 24-hour period. We're looking at almost 32,000 containers on a daily basis to ensure that we know what's coming into the United States. And so when we talk about big data and cyber, the real issue is it cuts across the entire organization. Everybody has some sort of big data requirements. I wanted to add this slide in here to give you some idea from a first responder's vantage point how important it is and where we see shortfalls in this communications envelope that we have. So at the top of the chart is multi-band radio, and that's something we fielded that I alluded to that gives first responders the ability to communicate on a common channel. Again, there is a cost involved with procuring that radio, and that's a great system for land mobile radio, read, push-to-talk systems. Most first responders know those as bricks and are very familiar with carrying those around. That's great, but the real problem is how do we push data out to first responders so that you can get situational awareness, so that you can get the map graphics and the information in a form that you can use. And so what we're working on at the bottom is the second prong, which is going to be bringing the broadband to our public safety data applications and getting it out where first responders actually work and live. So that's what we're thinking about in terms of our tactical communications. It's very, very important to us. I also wanted to talk very briefly about layered security solutions, and this gets back to the point I was making about preparedness. And what you see on this chart are a lot of technologies, but the real secret sauce is not the individual technologies, but it's how they are combined by putting common operating data, by putting governance and sharing, by having standards. That's what we did with the multiband radio to get that fielded. We put out a standard so that any company that met the standard could in fact could sell their system. Standard operating procedures and training and exercises. So by linking all of the technologies with those capabilities that I show in the blue ellipses, that's where you get the power to the first responders. And that's where we're working to see if we can increase first responder capacity. The final slide are just some conclusions. I did talk about this complex and evolving series of threats. We are more rather than less concerned. We think that the number of threats are going to increase, and so we are looking at preparedness. I also shared with you this idea that cybersecurity and emergency communications and big data are touching all of our areas within the department. And I would submit, if you're a first responder, they are also touching you and the work that you do. And then finally, we recognize that it's very important that we do have an appropriate balance of both the security piece, but also the civil liberties and the privacy. And that's something that's been very important to deal with.